Welcome everyone. Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ed Pritchard and I work for Miami Eco Adventures, the division of Miami-Dade Parks. This webinar series, Conservation Conversations, is a joint effort between UF IFAS Extension, Florida Sea Grant, and Miami Eco Adventures. So it's really great to start off a new season of these webinars. It's great to see some of our returning participants. I'm really happy that you're able to join us once again, and welcome and thank you to those who are joining for the first time. So like I said, we're excited to offer this new season, this new crop of topics. We'll be having some great speakers lined up. We have presentations lined up through December, every second Wednesday at 6 p.m. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we go ahead and jump into tonight's presentation. Everyone is currently muted in the chat. Everyone's currently muted. I ask that you guys please keep your microphones muted for the purposes of everyone else listening in. And if you have any questions throughout the presentations, you can go ahead and put those into the chat. I'll be moderating that throughout, and we'll take those questions at the end of the talk. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out the link to this recording usually by the next day, and that way you can share, or if you missed some of it, you can go ahead and watch that. We can also send out the registration link. I'll put it in the chat box as well for the upcoming presentation. So where you registered for tonight's talk, you can register for all of the talks that we have this season through December. If you'd like to receive, an email with, a list of those, the upcoming webinar and the topics, well, you can go ahead and put the email for our speaker tonight, Anna, and she can send you that information as well. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat in a minute. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put those in there as well. So feel free to settle in on the couch. If you're hungry, go ahead and prep and eat dinner. And listen in on this great presentation we have in store for you tonight from Anna. So without further ado, Anna, if you want to take it away, welcome again to Conservation Conversations.
Great, thanks so much, Ed. Welcome everybody, happy September. And we're really excited that you're here tonight, and we hope you enjoy your evening with us and that you'll come back. All right, so we're gonna get right into it and talk about marine protected areas. We're going to begin with defining what these are, talk about a little bit about how we got here, how these came to be, some of the pros and cons of marine protected areas, or MPAs for short, and then talk about where the confusion comes in. And then we'll also touch upon a few local examples here within the United States. Before we do that, I'm gonna warm you guys up with a poll. I'm gonna ask Ed to launch this poll, and you should see a dialog box pop up on your screen with a single question. And you'll just use your mouse to select your answer and then hit submit. And the question is, what is a marine protected area? Is it A, a marine area that has special recognition? B, a marine area that is closed to fishing only? C, a marine area open for everything except people? Or D, an area closed to all consumptive uses, for example, boating, fishing, and diving? Your answers are anonymous, so please don't fear if you think you are right or maybe not. And go ahead and make your selection and then hit enter or submit, whatever it says at the bottom. And we'll give it, Ed, maybe we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, just so that as many folks can participate as possible.
Sounds good.
All right, and we got 1 or 2 left. If you're able to participate, that would be great. All right, Ed, why don't you go ahead?
Looks like we captured a good amount.
Sweet, thank you. All right, and Ed, could you please share those results with the group?
Sure.
All right, so it looks like about half of you chose A, a couple people chose B, and almost the other half chose D. All right, so let's go on with the big reveal. The correct answer was A. A marine protected area, or an MPA, is a marine area that has special recognition. Thanks for helping me with that, Ed. I want to go into a couple of different definitions because there are several. This is a term that's used around the world. The International Union for Conservation of Nature defines MPA as a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. That's pretty comprehensive. And I want to look at one more for the time being. World Conservation Union takes this a step further and specifies that an MPA is any area of the intertidal or subtidal terrain, together with its overlying water and associated flora, fauna, historical and cultural features, which has been reserved by law or other effective means to protect part or all of the enclosed environment. So I thought that first definition was pretty good, but then I read this one and I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's pretty good. I think they nailed it. So how did we get here? How did we start using this terminology? How did we start protecting different parts of the ocean? And I want to go back in time a little bit. And please note that this timeline is not to scale. It does not contain every single piece of environmental or marine related legislation, but I wanted to highlight a few of the key pieces that brought us to where we are. And first here, starting on the left, we have the Organic Act of 1916. And this was the act that created the National Park Service, which was installed to protect these beautiful places within the United States. And I want to make sure that you all just tuck back in your mind that the majority of these at that time were on land. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of extra thought or protections in place for the ocean, not until we started getting towards the latter half of the 20th century. Particularly once we started getting towards the late 1960s and the early 1970s, when this country was experiencing its first major waves, pardon the pun, of their environmentalism and environmental movements. We had the Clean Water Act established in 1972, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act also in that year, Endangered Species Act in 1973. In 1976, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery and Conservation Management Act, which really looked closely at how fishing was managed here. Later in the 1980s, marine reserves started to become more popular as a fishery management tool, and we'll look more closely at that in a little bit. And then in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton established Executive Order 13158, which called for a scientifically based, comprehensive national system of MPAs representing diverse U.S. marine ecosystems and the nation's natural and cultural resources. And so that's pretty critical that this piece of legislation was put into place specifically to create MPAs. And so that was designated specifically, and it came with its own definition that was talking just about the United States, delineating MPAs as any area of the marine environment that has been reserved by federal, state, territorial, tribal, local laws or regulations to provide lasting protection for part or all of the natural and cultural resources therein. So that's what Executive Order 13158 did. As part of that, the NOAA, or National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Marine Protected Areas Center, was established. The last piece of this timeline, these two I'll discuss a little bit more shortly, was the Convention on Biological Diversity's target of 10% of the ocean in an MPA by the year, originally 2012, but then got later moved to 2020. So file that away for later. That will be, we'll revisit that in a little while. On the screen are the three major goals of NOAA's MPA Center. And this MPA Center is administered in cooperation with the US Department of the Interior, and it developed a framework for the national system of MPAs. And the center provides multiple levels of agency support and information and technology and strategies to support the MPAs in the United States. This MPA Center is also actively engaged with MPA programs around the world and serves as the hub for the Office of the National Marine Sanctuary's international work. MPAs are governed or administered by a number of different bodies, agencies, and organizations. And this logo here, or this graphic, comes straight from the MPA website, the NOAA MPA Center website, to show that that MPA Center is at the center and coordinates between all of these different bodies for the ultimate goal of protection, preservation, and conservation. Why do we want MPAs? Why are MPAs even on our radar? And it's important to remember that these are places with valued habitats, particular species, and or features in not just the oceans, estuaries, and coasts, but also the Great Lakes. And these areas are chosen for their ecological, cultural, and economic benefits. Often, these MPAs are planned and implemented in specifically designed networks. And when I refer to networks, that's referring usually to spatial or geographic location to achieve the maximum benefit possible. In this graphic here along the bottom, this is demonstrating connectivity between habitats. And the idea of habitat connectivity is referring to spatially separate areas that can be linked to similar areas that might not necessarily be close in proximity. On the other side of the coin is seascape connectivity, referring to when habitats that are different are connected via the same ecosystem. An example of this is seagrasses connected to mangroves or seagrasses to coral reefs. And these are two strategies and two things that are considered among many others in designing MPAs. So here's where some of the confusion comes in, and I think this was captured pretty well in that opening poll. Some folks are familiar with the term marine reserves, and marine reserves and MPAs are very frequently used in the same sentence, in the same process, in the same publication, but sometimes there's a lack of clarity as to which term is referring to what. And marine reserves is, as defined by the scientist Ballantine, a permanently closed to all fishing and other extracted uses with limited exceptions for research and education by permit. These are also referred to as no-take areas, non-consumptive areas, fishery reserves, marine ecological reserves, fully protected areas, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, a marine reserve is an MPA with a higher level of protection. According to the NOAA MPA Center, here in the United States, 26 of our waters are protected in an MPA. So about a quarter of the waters in our country. Of that 26%, 3% are in a no-take marine reserve in a non-consumptive area. I wanted to show you all a little bit more in terms of the data of how all of this breakdown truly looks. And within that 26% of MPAs in the country, this graph shows that the highest amount of that, almost half, is in the Pacific Islands. On the other side of the coin, we have Alaska that has less than 1% of its waters in an MPA. Here, in Florida, we're in the Southeast region. We have less than 2, the entire Southeast region has less than 2% of its waters in an MPA. One of the features of the NOAA MPA Center website is an interactive map in which you can zoom in to pretty much anywhere you want, and you can very easily ascertain which waters are in what type of protected zone. It's really cool. Here in Florida, we have 366 MPAs, and that includes no-take reserves. And this is just showing South Florida. So all of this blue area, these are all indicating an MPA. Red areas are no-take areas, are marine reserves. So you can see that in comparison to just this MPA area in South Florida, marine reserves are much, much smaller. As I mentioned, where a lot of confusion and uncertainty, and I will even say fear and discomfort come in, is the confusion of MPA with marine reserve. And this has been particularly evident during public planning and scoping, that these terms are used and often thought of interchangeably, which they're very much not. We're going to talk about some differences coming up now. I like Venn diagrams. I think they can be really useful to give you an idea of different concepts tying to very similar topics. Here on the left, we have marine protected areas. Here on the right, we have marine reserves, and in the middle is where they overlap. And I think this can make it a little bit easier to visually understand. I like visual learning myself. I think it helps me grasp concepts that are sometimes good on paper, not so much in practice. And just to go over these, MPAs are not necessarily restrictive. There are quite a few MPAs that allow for consumptive activities, including both commercial and recreational fishing. They can be de facto in nature, meaning the designation or delineation of an area as a park or preserve, in essence, automatically makes it a marine protected area. Versus marine reserve, and forgive me, because this top really should be in the center, no matter what the designation, they all have to be explicitly communicated and designed. The MPA, or excuse me, see, I just did it. The marine reserve also offers species-specific protection. We'll talk about a few examples of that. They're both forms of spatial management. They both offer habitat protection, and they both can be designed strategically in networks. The main difference is that the marine reserves do restrict some, if not many, forms of consumptive activities. I wanted to offer up a few examples of local MPAs here in South Florida. So there are, as I mentioned, 366 throughout the state. These are specific to Southeast Florida, namely Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. And when the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary was created in 1990, it absorbed the pre-existing Key Largo and Looe Key National Marine Sanctuaries that had been in existence they'd been created under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act in 1977 and 1981, respectively. Those both became absorbed into the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So we've got quite a few locally, and I'm sure that if you're not in Miami-Dade County, you've probably got some that you can name as well. I want to return for a moment to marine reserves and talk a little bit more about some of the benefits that they offer. This graphic was created by the Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies of Coastal Oceans, and it does a great job of explaining how marine reserves and networks of them are beneficial. And the main concept that this graphic is depicting is this idea of what's known as the spillover effect. If any of you have spent time on the ocean, you might be familiar with the idea that fish and other mobile organisms don't necessarily recognize boundaries, and often, if not a lot of the time, spend their life cycles in various parts of the ocean. So if, say, this square box is indicative of one marine reserve or one no-take area, while those fish are in this area, they are afforded protections from human influence and can grow up. If they remain in this area, they can grow up, can reproduce, and their population, as they increase, can in effect spill over or move outside that boundary zone, which is pretty cool. And that's also important considering how highly migratory species move through the oceans and through different ecosystems. And if we're looking at this square as an idea of a marine reserve, this is also really easy to visualize. If you were looking at this on a nautical chart or on the display on a boat, a square is pretty easy to know when you're in it and when you're out of it. And it also makes enforcement a lot more manageable. To spell it out a little bit more, we'll look at some of the pros and cons. Marine reserves do protect multiple types of species. It offers protection to habitat. It can create that spillover effect. It reduces impacts from human influence. It can also offer a baseline for scientific research, particularly if marine reserves are sited in an area that in which conditions might be as close to pristine or original, for lack of a better word, as possible. Marine reserves can also be changed in their size. They can be made larger or smaller upon evaluation. Some of the negatives is that it is an approach that's considered restrictive and often has trouble getting support or community buy-in. There are potential economic impacts. In other words, if a marine reserve is sited in an area where commercial lobster fishermen may have fished, that has to be considered and factored into doing the types of studies that are required before this can even become legally implemented. Also, if they're not really carefully considered and studied well, they might not be effective if they're not sited in the best place possible, depending on the goals of the area. And lastly, these are processes that take years. I'm not talking 1 to 2 years, I'm talking 5 to 10 years. So it's a very lengthy and often expensive process to get them implemented. I wanted to give you guys a few examples of some networks of MPAs and marine reserves in the United States. Only 2 states have had very specific processes to create strategic networks of MPAs in this country. One is Hawaii, the second is California. This photograph is of Channel Islands National Park. And in the 1990s, the state of California responded to concerns about overfishing by implementing a network of MPAs through 2 science-based decision-making processes. The first process was focused on the Channel Islands, and the second addressed the entire state coastline, specifically following the state's Marine Life Protection Act. These are 2 maps that show MPAs in California prior to 2003 on the left, and those are indicated by these tiny red dots. It might be a little bit tough to see, but these are all MPAs, these tiny red dots, versus the MPAs that are in effect as of 2013. So it's the same red dots, and it should be a little bit easier to see that there are more of them. Various colors that you see on the screen are showing different study regions that were studied and designed prior to the implementation of these MPAs. And by the year 2011, the state of California had created 132 MPAs covering more than 15% of the coastline. And of those, 11 are no-take marine reserves. And what made this is considered a groundbreaking process. And the key to that was that this is an adaptive management strategy that was designed to ensure ecosystem sustainability. And something that was considered was that the different regions have very different ecologies. So that was studied very, very carefully and planned for. And this network design involved significant stakeholder input and relied upon scientific data, including models and studies of ocean circulation, larval dispersal, optimal size and spacing distances, and projected impacts on commercial and recreational fisheries. This planning approach allowed California to leverage ecological connectivity to maximize conservation and economic outcomes throughout the state's waters. And it can certainly serve as a model for other states who have similar intentions or similar goals. This is showing a map of the state of Hawaii. The chain of islands is here on your lower right. To the left, let me take a deep breath because I want to say this correctly. Papaha Naua Moku, Mokua. I had it earlier. I practiced it. I nailed it. Let me try it one more time. Papahana Hanau Mokua Kea Marine National Monument in Hawaii. That's a really tough one, guys. I'm going to keep practicing. And that national monument, the original boundary, I'm tracing my mouse around it. It's a light blue dotted line that's roughly in the center of your screen. And the dark blue solid line represents current boundary. And if any of you have been following any of these more recent ocean policy decisions, in August 2016, just a few months before he left office, President Barack Obama expanded the area of the original monument by almost 4 times its size. And the expanded monument at the time was the world's largest marine protected area. The size of the original monument was roughly 140,000 square miles. Now it sits at almost 583,000 square miles. And if you're able to see this teeny tiny print on the screen, this is only 6 square miles of land. So it truly is a marine national monument. And this size of 582,578 square miles is roughly the size of the Gulf of Mexico. It's pretty incredible. Lastly, I just want to give you guys a local example. If you're familiar with the dry tortugas, which are roughly 70 miles off of the coast of Key West, in 2001, an ecological reserve was established. It contained 2 reserves, the North and then the South Reserve. And it was established in waters managed by the state of Florida, Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and the Gulf of Mexico Fisheries Management Council. Ecological Reserve is a 391 kilometer squared area that is made up of these 2 sections. North, which contains some of the most pristine coral reefs in the Florida Keys, and Tortuga South, which encompasses Riley's Hump, 30-meter tall seamount that has been identified as a critical spawning site for many fish, including 5 commercially important snapper species. 6 years later, in 2007, a research natural area was established by the National Park Service. This is a 119 kilometers squared area where fishing and anchoring are prohibited. And between these three reserves, it protects some of the most productive and least disturbed marine areas with corals and fish populations that are overfished elsewhere. And secondly, and really importantly for us here in Southeast Florida, these reserves protect an important regional source of larval and juvenile fish and coral organisms for the Florida Keys and Southeast Florida. There are quite a lot of publications on just how well these reserves have been performing. Like any management policy or approach, it has its own set of challenges. And so one of those main ones is that a lot of the scientists who study these types of management strategies are very concerned that the label of MPA is creating an illusion of conservation. The literature is pretty firm that MPAs alone aren't enough, that in addition to that designation of MPA, that marine reserves are needed to see the benefits to both species and ecosystem. Enforcement is a challenge. There's a lot of water that requires a set of individuals who know how to operate boats and can manage and read nautical charts and enforce boundaries and enforce regulations. So this is challenging, as the shapes and the designs of the boundaries can be tricky, as can understanding what certain terminology means in certain areas, as well as what can be done where, what rules are in place in which zone, in whatever zone that you're in. And lastly, this requires a lot of coordination between half a dozen different agencies. Here in Florida, we've got the National Park Service, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, NOAA, Florida Fish and Wildlife, and 2 fishery management councils that all have input and help make decisions as to the different regulations in place in the water. As I mentioned, terminology and naming is a huge issue. And that's in particular here in Southeast Florida, because so many of our ecosystems, not only are they similar, but they are connected. And as an individual who spends a lot of time in these areas, both in a research and recreational capacity, I often comment to my fellow boaters and divers how difficult it is to know where we are, what buoy means what are the rules for that buoy, what are the rules in this area. And even those who have the best intentions can often find themselves being violators of some rule or another. And here on the bottom, so first of all, even within a lot of the scientific literature, some of them were really challenging to process because marine reserve was used interchangeably with MPA. And down here, Southeast Florida, we have SPA, Sanctuary Preservation Area, Research Natural Area, Ecological Reserve, and Marine Reserve Zone. Terminology, different agencies that are all referring to the same thing. Head explosion. I do want to recognize that there are opportunities for improved understanding and compliance. This photograph on the left shows a yellow buoy. This is one of the Molasses Reef SPA or Sanctuary Preservation Area buoys that marks the corner of that large no-take zone that goes around Molasses Reef in Key Largo. So these are the large yellow buoys, and this little red no smoking sign says no take, no fishing, nothing. Last year, Biscayne National Park, which rests just north of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, implemented 5 new and slightly different MPAs. They're called CRPAs, or Coral Reef Protection Areas, in which no lobstering is allowed. And that's what this red no smoking sign indicates, is there's no lobstering. In an effort to try and present consistent messaging, the park chose to utilize buoys that were very, very similar to those used in the sanctuary preservation areas to the south, in hopes that it would at least perk up or catch boaters' attention. They were entering an area with a different level or a different type of protection. So this is certainly a good first step in trying to create some sort of uniformity or consistency between different MPAs. I promised you I'd get back to this, and I finally did. If you remember that last ticker on the timeline in the beginning, I mentioned that the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity had an original target that 10% of the world's oceans would be protected by an MPA by the year 2012. In the year 2012, only 1.17% of this was met. So that pushed the target to 2020. There are 196 countries that are part of this goal. The data are not available for all of them yet, but since the US has 26% of its waters within an MPA, they've exceeded their goal for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So certainly there's something to be said for starting to make waves in this worldwide protection effort. As we continue moving forward into the 21st century, there is still a lot to do. None of these processes happen in secret. They are all public and community-based. And there's a lot of opportunity to continue building community capacity through education and outreach, and further engaging all different types of stakeholders or the people who rely upon and use these areas. It's critical that managers consider and examine adding more marine reserves to existing MPAs, as well as factoring in current and future predicted changes due to global climate change. And as I've mentioned before, clear and consistent communication is incredibly important in order for this to be successful. And I'm going to end this on a bright note that here in Southeast Florida, we have a new MPA, originally called the Southeast Florida Ecosystem Conservation Area. This was officially established on July 1st, 2018 by House Bill 53. And this area includes sovereign submerged lands and state waters offshore of Martin, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties. And just this year, on July 1st, this area was renamed to become the Kristen Jacobs Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area in honor of the woman who is the late state representative for Broward County. Now, management considerations for areas within this boundary are being considered through a variety of previous and current stakeholder engagement strategies. So this former section, which is encompassing the northernmost third of our entire Florida coral reef, now has a name, now has recognition, and will be able to progress forward with coming up with other management strategies. There are tons of free and easily accessible publications about marine protected areas and marine reserves, and I encourage you to dig into them. It's pretty fascinating reading. Ed, I'm going to ask you to put up one last poll, and I'm hoping everybody will participate. This is just for us to try and capture some demographics. The first is just asking you to tell us if you learned something. The first, indicate your level of agreement. I learned something from participating in this webinar. A, you strongly agree or learned a lot. B, you agree or learned something. Or C, disagree, you didn't learn anything new. Number two, how many people were watching this webinar, including yourself? Now, we're not looking for you to try and guess the total number that are visible on the participants list. This is simply looking to find out who is physically with you, if anyone is with you in your home or your car or your office at the moment. Is it just you? Is it 2 of you, 3 of you, 4 or more? And finally, if you would, please tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Miami-Dade County, elsewhere in sunny Florida, elsewhere in the US, or elsewhere in the world? If you don't mind filling that out and hitting submit, we can let that go another couple of seconds, Ed.
I think we've captured quite a few of us. Thank you guys for answering those questions. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Yeah, guys, please, I look forward to your questions and thank you for your time.
Yes, thanks, Anna, for kicking off our fall series with a great talk. Definitely informative and demystifying. So as she mentioned, if you do have any questions now that we've reached the end of the presentation, please throw them in there. Any comments, we'd love to hear them, and we'll take some time to answer those. If you have to leave, that's perfectly fine. Like we said, we'll send out an email with the recording, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. I'll be presenting on Queen Conch on October 13th, I believe. And so that'll be our next talk. So it's the second Wednesday of the month. All right, so I will go ahead and check the chat now. Anna threw in her email too, so that way you can reach out to her if you have any questions that you think of after, or if you want to get an email from us just to kind of send you our topics for the season, we're happy to do that. So thanks for putting that in there. So I'll go ahead and start off the questions. We have one from Anthony. Good to see you, Anthony. He asked, he lives up in the Cape Cod National Seashore. Is that an MPA? He says the national park is a couple hours from his house, but he was wondering what that protection was, if you knew.
If you're off a national, oh, I know Anthony. Hi, Anthony. The Cape Cod National Seashore would be considered an MPA. And you can, that's going to be, national seashores are managed through the National Park Service. So you could check that out specifically, and you could even look that up on the NOAA MPA Center website, and it'll tell you all of the area that's protected, whether it's in square miles, square kilometers, or nautical miles. There's a million different types of measurements, and they'll tell you what's allowed there and what's not allowed there. So that's a great example. National Seashore is certainly an example of an MPA.
Great. Our next question comes from Jenna. She says, what is the difference between a marine sanctuary and an MPA? What are some of those differences?
It's Jenna, you know, this is your question gets to the heart of some of what makes this confusing, frankly. The National Marine Sanctuary, that's specifically designated through the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, and that requires presidential and representation from the House and the Senate to designate a national marine sanctuary. Versus an MPA, for example, if you remember when I mentioned the concept of, there's this idea of quote paper parks and de facto MPAs. Just in nature of it being a park, you could call, if you're familiar with Miami-Dade County, Crandon Park could be considered an MPA. Although now I'm going to check on the list that I exported from the NOAA website. So you've got things that are MPAs by their designation or recognition from either federal, state, or local government or tribal group, but a marine sanctuary that actually goes through its own political process to become established.
Okay, that's definitely helpful. So our next question comes from, let's see, Jennifer. So she says, how far around the yellow buoys, the ones that you were showing down in the Keys, does the protection extend?
Okay, I don't remember, well, I'm not sure which yellow buoys you're talking about, Jennifer, but if you imagine, as an example, imagine a square box, and one of those yellow buoys are in all 4 corners. Those yellow buoys are indicating that area between the four corners, that's where whatever the rules or regulations extend, whether it's no lobstering or whether it's no fishing. And if you look on the National Park Service website, if you look on Biscayne National Park Service's website, it now has the new coral reef protection areas, which are all very definitively either squares or rectangles. Those are now listed on the website, and it shows the latitude and longitude of where those boundaries are. And similarly, within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, you can find all of that information for all of the sanctuary preservation areas, which were the other yellow buoys. But I don't think those are all necessarily in perfect squares or rectangles. So the size is just dependent upon how the size was delineated by the managers when those areas were created.
Gotcha. All right, we have a question here, actually from Jennifer again. She says, may have missed this. Did the Convention on Biological Diversity reach its goal of 10% by 2020?
I was wondering if someone was going to catch that. That was a good catch, Jennifer. I was breaking my neck to try and get that answered. Right now, the answer is I'm not certain, because each one of the countries has to submit data. Not all of, there aren't answers from all 196 countries. So at this point, it's still unknown. We know that as one member with 195 other members, we know that the US met that criteria, but we don't have all of the data to say yes or no for that entire effort.
Gotcha. All right. Any other questions from, or any comments that you might have?
And I love these thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was a good insightful question there. Hannah, I had a question regarding, some of these MPAs, once they're created, what kind of tools do, these government, and these different agencies use to, kind of collect that critical information? They're maybe creating these MPAs to protect a certain species. How are they tracking that information, to make sure that they meet their objectives? For example, if they're trying to protect sharks, how are they getting that critical data to see how, if that MPA is being effective? What are some tools that they might use?
I'm glad that you asked that, Ed. With the creation of whatever type of area it is, whether it's an MPA or whether it's a no-take or different type of other type of reserve or management zone, with it comes a plan. They can't, the managers or the policymakers can't just say, well, we're not going to have no fishing in this 100 square mile area and hope for the best. Within that decision has to be a plan of how that's going to be tracked, how there's going to be monitoring associated. So with the dry tortugas reserves, they had, I think, they had to come up with reports every 5 years documenting. So usually before these things are established, baseline studies are collected, whether it's fish counts or coral counts or general presence, absence of general, like a BioBlitz type of thing, what's here
Right.
versus what's not. And then at whatever intervals, whether it's every 5 years or every 3 years, that type of study will be repeated. So that way those changes over time can be quantified. So, and even within I read one paper that showed the establishment of some of the early spas within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, showed scientists discovered aggregations of black grouper within those spas within the first few years after they were implemented, which is pretty neat.
Yeah.
So, and those are all, they're not secret, they're public information. It has to be, especially
Disseminated to the public. Yeah.
Exactly. It has to be, it's all public record.
Okay, thanks. That definitely answers the question. All right. Well, thank you guys all again. Again, if you think of any questions, after the presentation, you're welcome to email Anna. She put her email in the chat. And we really do appreciate you guys coming out tonight. I hope you guys were all able to learn something from tonight's presenter. Thank you again, Anna, for that great presentation. And we will hopefully see you. Again, we have the link for the next, and actually the planned talks through the rest of the fall. So you can register for those talks at that link. I'll throw it in there once more. And we hope to see you back in October.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.